In 1991, archaeologists opened 6 graves on Bering Island and thought they had found the commander. One grave was deeper than the others. One body seemed to have been treated with more care. The story looked ready to close. Vitus Bering, dead in December 1741, lifted from the sand 2.5 centuries later. Then the evidence refused to stay simple. The teeth did not fit the public scurvy story as neatly as people wanted. The translation of Steller's burial note was disputed. The place of the grave was disputed. Even the face reconstructed from the skull became part of the argument. 77 men had sailed on the St. Peter, 45 came back, and even the grave of the commander may not be what the story says it is. That is the right place to begin, because Bering's last voyage is usually told as a heroic death story. Old explorer reaches America, falls ill, dies of scurvy on a remote island. But the cleaner that version becomes, the less it explains. The island did not create the disaster. Scurvy did not create the whole disaster. They exposed something already built into the expedition, a voyage bigger than the margin meant to bring it home. Before this is over, Bering will be lying in a sand hollow on a beach the crew still hopes might be Kamchatka. Steller will keep men alive with fresh meat, herbs, and the animals of the island. Waxel will turn the wreck of the St. Peter into a new little vessel and bring 45 survivors back to Petropavlovsk. But the case begins earlier, on paper, with a plan that imagined the North Pacific could be handled inside a single season. The second Kamchatka expedition was not just a voyage. It was an imperial machine stretched across Siberia. The Russian Admiralty wanted the eastern edge of the empire mapped. It wanted the question of Asia and America answered. It wanted harbors, coasts, islands, timber, minerals, routes, and proof that geography could become control. Bering knew distance better than most men in that system. He had already crossed Siberia once. He knew distance not as a line on a map, but as exhaustion, broken animals, frozen rivers, delayed orders, rotten provisions, arguments over labor, and months lost before a ship ever touched open water. The first Kamchatka expedition had proved that a Russian vessel could be built in the Far East and sent north through the strait that later carried his name. But it had not settled the larger question. Bering had not seen the American coast. So the second expedition became bigger, more detachments, more surveyors, more scientific men, more wagons, boats, animals, tools, flour, anchors, sails, and instructions. The distance between St. Petersburg and the Pacific was not background. It was the first expedition inside the expedition. There is a problem with the record before the voyage even begins. The surviving case file is overwhelmingly Russian and European. Indigenous people appear when the expedition needs them to appear, as residents, interpreters, boatmen, suppliers, guides, laborers, observers, or people encountered along a route already being drawn for imperial use. The Library of Congress description of Bering's earlier mapping world names Yakuts, Koryaks, Chukchi, Evenks, Itelmen, Ainu, rivers, portages, and coasts. Those names on a map are not the same as those communities speaking in the archive. So this episode has to carry a warning label. We can see where indigenous people carried, guided, interpreted, supplied, resisted, and were observed. But we rarely hear what they thought this expedition meant. By 1740, the St. Peter and the St. Paul were at Avacha Bay. The harbor of St. Peter and St. Paul, later Petropavlovsk, became the base from which Bering and Alexei Chirikov would sail east in 2 vessels. On the 4th June 1741, they left Kamchatka. The plan had a hard edge. The Sea Council in May placed the voyage inside 1 season. Go east, search for land. Return before autumn made the ship a prisoner of weather. On a council table, that sounds orderly. At sea, every decision spends the same shrinking account. Every bay examined costs daylight. Every cask filled costs wind. Every hour spent proving the coast is real comes out of the reserve needed to cross back. This is the fatal assumption of the voyage, that the expedition could scale up its ambition without scaling up its margin. On the map, the assumption looks technical. Kamchatka, unknown water, America, return before the season closes. On board, it has another shape. Biscuit, water casks, a sick man trying to stand watch, a ship stopping to refill while the wind that might have carried it home moves on. That difference between the map and the deck is where the disaster begins. On 16th of July, the St. Peter sighted the high coast near Mount Saint Elias. That should have been the climax. The ship had reached what it had been sent to find. Instead, it became the worst possible moment to realize the voyage was only half over. Bering did not have the luxury of making America the end of the story. He had to get the same ship back across the same ocean, with a crew already spending its return strength. The sight of Mount Saint Elias answered the Admiralty's question. It did not prove the voyage could survive the answer. On 20th of July, the St. Peter anchored near Kayak Island. Steller went ashore and worked at extraordinary speed. He observed plants, terrain, and traces of human presence. Later scientific histories would give that landing enormous weight. The first documented European landing on the northwest coast of North America, and the first preserved natural history collections from that coast. But on the ship, the problem was simpler. They needed fresh water. Steller's journal preserves a tense scene off the coast. People in skin boats approached the vessel. The Russians tried to exchange small gifts. A Koryak interpreter was sent toward shore. Steller noticed signs that water might be found there. The indigenous side of that encounter does not survive in matching words. The archive gives us the ship, the interpreter, the European observer, and the officer's decision. It does not give us the islanders' account of what they intended, what they feared, or what they understood about the strangers offshore. That silence limits the story. It changes what we can honestly claim. Bering wanted to leave. Steller wanted time ashore. Waxel and the officers had their own sense of what the council plan required. The records do not give a clean private transcript of the argument. They show the consequence. The expedition had found America and still kept losing days to water, charting, uncertainty, and contrary wind. After Kayak Island, the story changes shape. The question is no longer whether Bering can reach America. The question is whether the St. Peter can get home after reaching it. The answer begins in small losses. The ships had separated in June. Chirikov's St. Paul made its own landfall and its own damaged return. Bering's St. Peter moved west through islands, fog, uncertain positions, and worsening health. In the Shumagin Islands, the search for water became a trap. Boats went ashore, men were soaked, signals were missed or delayed, time was burned on the one thing no ocean crossing can survive without. Water is a small word for a large physical problem. Every stop demanded men who could still row. Every soaked coat became weight. Every missed signal meant another day for the sick list to grow. Hands blistered on wet oars. Coats froze stiff at night. Men came back colder than when they had left and less able to go again. By late summer, the expedition was no longer trading time for information. It was trading time for the means to keep moving. That is what the heroic version usually hides. A chain can become fatal even when each link looked defensible in the moment. Steller's anger at the officers has shaped many later tellings of this voyage. He was brilliant, observant, useful, and often furious. He preserved details no ship log would have bothered to preserve. He was also not a neutral witness. That makes him valuable and dangerous at the same time. The logbook gives the dry skeleton. Dates, winds, deaths, positions, orders. Steller gives the flesh. Damaged mouths, cold men, wet clothing, animals bold enough to steal clothing and bite at the helpless. The episode needs both, and it needs the distance between them. The ship was still afloat, but the crew was becoming too weak to sail it. That is the next turn. Not a dramatic wreck, not yet. A living vessel with a dying human engine. By late October, the St. Peter was approaching land the crew hoped was Kamchatka. It was not. On 29th October, land appeared. On 4th November, another landfall came into view. They believed, or wanted to believe, that they were near the coast they needed. They were near Bering Island. The point of no return was not one grand order. It was the accumulated moment when the ship could no longer be handled by a healthy crew. Frost's reconstruction of the late voyage, using the log and reports, notes that only a small number of weak men were still able to help. The St. Peter was not merely off course. It was losing the people needed to correct the course. On the 6th November, the ship reached the island. The first shelter was barely shelter at all. Men dug into sand and covered pits with sailcloth. They collected driftwood. They carried the sick ashore. Some died in boats or on the beach. Steller's description of scurvy is not subtle. Mouths damaged so badly that eating itself became painful. The island did not immediately become a refuge. It first became a sorting ground. The men who could move dug. The men who could not move waited. The ship still held provisions, tools, and government property, but the beach had almost no spare labor to move them. Here, command turns into carrying capacity. Rank still exists. Orders still exist. But an order that cannot lift an anchor, haul a cable, or bring flour above the tide line is only partly an order. The legend says Bering died of scurvy, and Waxel's report says exactly that. The record is more difficult. We know scurvy was present. We know Waxel, writing after the voyage, attributed Bering's death to it. We know the 1991 excavation team argued that the skeleton identified as Bering did not show the expected scurvy evidence. We also know Lynn's later critique argues the grave identification itself may be wrong. So the honest line is this. Archaeology has complicated the scurvy story. It has not given us permission to replace it with a neat new diagnosis. What can be proven is broader and colder. Scurvy was part of the collapse. The failed margin made it lethal. Bering was carried ashore ill. He was no longer the commander of an expanding discovery. He was an old officer on a freezing beach, still trying to learn whether geography might save what command could not. On our 1st December, while still alive and still commanding, he sent Timofey Anshugov and 2 men along the shore to find out whether they were on the mainland or an island, and to look for forests. That is the last confirmed command action in the open log record. It is a small order, but it is devastating. Bering still wanted the old assumption to be true. If the land was Kamchatka, the expedition was wrecked but not isolated. If it was an island, the crew had to become a settlement. On 8th of December 1741 at 5 in the morning in the logbook, Bering died. Waxel succeeded to command. There is no need to make the death heroic. The record does not need that from us. The stronger image is smaller, a commander buried into sand for warmth, still trying to prove that the land beneath him belonged to the route home. The ship itself had already changed the story. On 28th of November, before Bering died, a storm broke the cable and drove the St. Peter onto the sandy beach near the place where the crew had wanted to haul her up. The storm destroyed the St. Peter. It also saved the survivors. That sounds impossible until you look at the beach. The hull was damaged. Salt water got in. Powder was ruined. Flour was soaked. But the ship was now close enough to become material. The men had wanted the vessel secured on the shore. They no longer had the strength to manage it. Then the weather threw the St. Peter there for them, ruining it as a ship and preserving it as a supply store. The recurring artifact of this episode is not a jewel or a relic. It is hardware: iron, fittings, fastenings, hoops, planks, rope, canvas, practical remains from a vessel that had stopped being a vessel and had become an inventory. That hardware matters because it reverses the heroic frame. The winter was not survived by courage as an abstraction. It was survived by salvage. Steller's role mattered. He understood plants, fresh food, and the island's animals in ways the naval officers did not. Fresh meat and fresh water improved the health of many survivors. His knowledge became more valuable once the ship ceased to function as a ship. But the survival winter is not helped by turning Steller into the pure hero and Bering into the obstacle. Steller's journal is vivid partly because he had grievances, and those grievances can tempt later readers into a simple moral drama. The case does not need one. The officers had a ship, orders, and a one-season plan. Steller had knowledge that became urgent once the expedition stopped being a voyage. Waxel inherited the least romantic part of command, keeping men alive after the plan had failed. On Bering Island, the problem kept changing. First, it was biological: scurvy, cold, weakness, food. Then it was carpentry: what can be cut from the wreck and made seaworthy? Then it was load: what can the new craft carry and what must be abandoned? In April, the survivors began dismantling the St. Peter. By early May, the keel of the new vessel was laid. The dimensions were small enough to feel absurd after the scale of the original expedition. About 36 feet long, 12 feet in beam, a little more than 5 feet deep. Into that craft had to go 45 men, food, water, tools, records, and the hope that Kamchatka was close enough. The Empire had launched a multi-year expedition across Siberia with ships, scientific detachments, official orders, maps, and a huge chain of transport. The survivors left the island in a craft shorter than many modern buses. By August 1742, the expedition had been reduced to the smallest floating object that could carry the living away. Waxel's decision was stark. There would be one trip. No man would be left behind. Only a small part of the supplies could be carried, because autumn storms made overloading deadly. At the end, survival meant choosing what not to save. Cannon, heavy material, surplus goods, even useful things lost value if they kept the little St. Peter from floating. On 13 August 1742, they sailed. The new vessel leaked almost immediately. Men threw weight overboard. The carpenter found the gap and patched it from inside. 2 days later, they saw land through mist and fog. On 27 August, the official account says they sailed into the harbor of Petropavlovsk. 45 returned. The return was not a rescue ending. It was the moment the disaster became a record. The men brought back the news of America, the memory of the island, and the records from which the case would be argued for centuries. This is what we know. The St. Peter sailed from Kamchatka in June 1741. It sighted the high coast near Mount Saint Elias on 16th July. It anchored near Kayak Island on 20th July. The return broke down through fog, water stops, sickness, and weakening labor. The ship reached Bering Island in November. Bering died on 8th December. Waxel took command. The survivors wintered there, dismantled the wreck, built a smaller vessel, and returned to Petropavlovsk in August 1742. This is what we do not know. We do not know the exact medical mechanism that killed Bering. We do not know whether the 6 graves opened in 1991 include him. We do not know every word exchanged between Bering, Steller, Waxel, and the officers during the arguments over delay in return. We do not have the indigenous account of the Kayak Island encounter in a matching contemporary voice. That boundary matters. A weaker story would choose one certainty and force the sources to obey it. Then the afterlife of the case began. 19th century imperial histories had reasons to make Bering into a state-building figure. Later popular versions had reasons to tighten the story into discovery, scurvy, death, and national claim. The archaeology of 1991 had its own public force. A grave opened, a skull reconstructed, a commander returned. For many years the story was simple. Bering died of scurvy, and archaeology found him. Then the grave itself became part of the evidence problem. Lynn's critique does not erase the expedition. It changes what we can say about the excavation. The 6 graves may not be the expedition graveyard. The translation of Steller's note may have moved the search area. The good teeth of the skeletons may not prove Bering's medical condition if the skeletons were not his crew at all. That is an archaeology rewrite ending, but not the usual kind. The artifact does not solve the case. It shows how careful a solved case has to be. In the end, Bering's last voyage should not be read as a heroic death caused by scurvy. It should be read as a logistics failure that scurvy exposed. Bering did not die at the beginning of the failure. He died when the failure could no longer hide itself. When the survivors sailed home in the little vessel built from the wreck, they were not carrying a clean legend. They were carrying a record with missing voices, disputed graves, and enough ship's hardware to show what had really saved them. Not glory, salvage.